Within the last decade, we've learned more about the 3-pound glob of mass that sits inside of our skull than any other human has ever known that has walked this planet. This brain is absolutely amazing. Like I said, it's only about 3 pounds. It puts off the equivalent of energy that maybe like a 15-watt light bulb. I mean, that's pretty modest. But it also comprises over 100 billion neurons. And each one of those neurons is connecting over 1,000 times. There's a trillion neural connections happening in our brain. And for every one of those neurons, there's actually 4 supportive cells we call glial cells. We used to think those were just there for support, but what we're going to talk about today, those glial cells are actually really, really important to your health. Now, this masterpiece is the most complex thing we have ever studied in the universe. And there's a lot that can go wrong. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time today, understanding the 7 drivers of broken brains. Now, last episode, we kind of talked about the state of affairs when it comes to, how our brains are working right now in Western civilization. And I promised on that last episode, we'd take a deeper dive today and we would get into some more the specific things that are going wrong so that we can create strategies and use the science and understanding that we've gained over the last decade or two and apply that to save our brains and heal our brains. Now, these 7 drivers are interrelated causes. They lie at the root of most mental and brain neurological issues. And so if we can tap into these, we can make a huge difference in our health and the health of our family. Now, one of the main challenges that we have is that we tend to kind of separate the brain from the rest of the body when we think about it. And so that's the first thing we need to change. We need to recognize that the brain and the body are interconnected, constantly talking and communicating, and what's happening in the brain is a reflection of what's happening everywhere. Now, what's happening in the brain is also intimately connected with what's happening in the mind, and so we're going to connect body-mind today as well. What I'm going to share today also, I want you to know, is for people who are doing great. They're functioning at a really high level. They just want to prevent brain problems in the future. Maybe they've seen their parents or their grandparents deal with memory decline or dementia or other neurodegenerative diseases, or maybe they have family members who are dealing with mental health issues and they just want to be on top of it. They want to prevent problems. That would be excellent. So what I'll talk about will help that. If you're already dealing with early stages of these problems, now it's really important time to take action. So it's not too late. Even if things are starting to get pretty severe and you feel like, lifestyle solutions aren't powerful enough, I'm going to tell you that they're very helpful and they should be employed at any point along the spectrum of disease. So regardless of where you are, preventing early onset, early stages, or even pretty severe decline, there are solutions and they're going to be found in these 7 major areas, okay? So let's just dive right in. I want to talk about the first main driver of neural problems and brain problems, and that is trauma. Now, what do I mean by trauma? I mean both physical trauma, like concussion and mild brain injury and even severe brain injury, as well as psychic trauma, psychological trauma. Now, psychological trauma is defined as damage or injury to the psyche. It's generally after living through an intense, stressful event or a series of events that has challenged our brain so much so that the brain kind of shifts into a different mode of being. It has a difficulty in coping with the real world the same way it did prior to, that event. And unfortunately, gosh, so many people have dealt with these horrific, extremely traumatic experiences in their life. Loss of loved ones, violence perpetrated against them, or violence just witnessed, perpetrated against someone else, natural disasters, man-made disasters. I mean, gosh, the list is almost endless. What's common between all of these various events is the intensity of the stress. and the shattering of the sense of security. So remember, our brain, its primary job is to keep us alive. And so things that threaten our survival and our security are like the most important things that the brain can perceive. So when we suffer traumatic events that challenge that sense of security, our brain shifts into a mode of constant vigilance, always on the lookout for the next danger and the next threat. We call this a fight or flight or freeze response, and the brain can get shifted into this kind of default mode. And it often kind of fractures our sense of self, and we come up with new strategies and alternatives to navigate our world. And that really can create huge shifts in our personality and really how we function. These emotional and psychological stressors can be one-time events, an accident, an injury, a violent attack, especially if it was unexpected and especially if it happened early in childhood. They can also be ongoing or kind of relentless exposures, such as living in a crime-ridden neighborhood or battling a life-threatening illness or, having a constant verbal or psychological abuse, bullying, domestic violence, these sort of things where the person just is kind of staying in that state all of the time. Commonly overlooked causes, especially in the early stages of life, are the sudden death of a loved one or, the loss of somebody close to you that you depend on. Even things later on in life, like the significant loss of a relationship, or something very humiliating or deeply embarrassing when people are deliberately cruel to us. I mean, these challenge our sense of self and they create these psychic wounds, these psychological traumas. And our brain actually gradually changes its physical structure. Now, that's an interesting thing. We get immediate mental changes and chemical changes, and then gradual physical changes. So now contrast that with concussion or traumatic brain injury or some other head trauma. Those create immediate physical structural changes in the brain, followed by a cascade of other chemical changes that eventually shift, the chemistry of the body and how it works. So it's like they're almost the two sides of the same coin. With psycho-emotional trauma, we get the changes in the chemistry and the framing of the world first that gradually shift the structure of the brain. And from a physical trauma side, we get immediate changes to the neurons and a gradual shift in the chemistry. But these traumatic events are happening so frequently. And we have, NFL football really to thank for our understanding of the role of traumatic brain injury and concussion because of all the money that's been spent researching what's happening in these repetitive head traumas. And now it's changing the entire landscape of sports and, childhood activities. I don't think I ever wore a helmet and I rode my bike as a kid. And now nobody leaves that. We're putting kids in helmets to walk to the mailbox. I'm just joking. But I mean, like, everybody's in a helmet and they should be. The number 2 driver of broken brains is nutritional deficiency. We know there are hosts of junk food in our diets. Not surprisingly, these drive dysfunction in our brain. Things like caffeine, refined sugar, even excess intake of fruits, too much sugar from fruits, hydrogenated oils and fats, think fried foods and chips and crackers, fast food, we'll call them ultra-processed foods, high sodium foods, genetically modified foods, particularly soy, alcohol, another driver of brain degeneration. So while some of these things are more obvious than others, some things are a little bit hard to find if you don't know how to read a food label. So there's a little aside, an education on how to read a food label and to know what you're looking for might be in order. If you want to clean up your diet, the best thing to do is turn to a paleo template. That just means a diet full of whole, real foods, foods that your grandmother would recognize, okay? Things that you could hunt, fish, pluck, pick, harvest, real foods. That's where we want to be. Instead, we go to the grocery store and we're picking from a whole bunch of things that weren't ever plants, but they were built in a plant by man. Listen to this. In Consumer Reports between the years of 1975 and 2008. So this is even old data. The number of products in the average supermarket went from 9,000 to 47,000. Now tell me, I wish I had more up-to-date research, but what do you think's happened since 2008? More and more and more and more. Probably 100,000 different, options as we go through the grocery store. There aren't 47,000 types of real food. Real food is, you know, what you're going to find on the perimeter of the grocery store, not in the middle of the grocery store. And almost all of these frankenfoods are man-made, and they drive our body crazy. They excite our neurons to death. They stimulate our brain to the point where we are constantly wanting more and more of them. And that's driving our reward pathways in our brain crazy. And that is affecting dopamine and other reward chemicals. So in contrast to these frankenfoods, we have real foods. Root vegetables contain grounding and soothing properties that help ease the effect of stress and cortisol. They're rich in B vitamins, which are critical for the brain. They're rich in antioxidants and omega-3 fats, which are really helpful for the brain. Things like wild salmon, walnuts, flax seeds, and chia seeds also have tons of these omega-3 fatty acids, which are really important for our cells. Other foods, specific foods known to be beneficial for the brain, are things like blueberries, almonds, spinach, some algae like spirulina and chlorella often people don't know about. Raspberries and dark chocolate are high in antioxidants. A pseudo grain called quinoa and red lentils. I mean, there's just a ton of things that are available with a quick Google search. Look for superfoods for the brain and get a list, and let's start trying to employ those into our daily diet. Okay, so once we've got our diet shifting and we're decreasing the processed foods and increasing whole foods, now we can look at the number 3 driver. That is our hormonal balance, our endocrine system. Hormones are basically an extension of the nervous system. The nervous system sends messages around the body with electrical impulses, but the endocrine system sends messages around the body via little chemicals we call hormones. But think of them both as communication systems. Every hormone that we know of, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, cortisol, they're all implicated in affecting the way the brain works. So understanding where those hormones are in your body right now and what their levels are can be a big insight into how your brain's going to function. Today, I want to focus on 2 that don't get much attention when we think of hormones, and that is cortisol and insulin. So what is cortisol? Cortisol is our stress hormone. We think about that being released in the body from our adrenal glands in response to stress. But it's also part of the circadian rhythm, the daily rhythm of life. Cortisol is the awake and alert system, and it is balanced against something called melatonin. Melatonin is another hormone as well. So, of course, we have a certain amount of cortisol being produced throughout the day, but when we're constantly in fight or flight or we're in high stress environments, our cortisol levels can rise too high. When cortisol is elevated, it becomes inflammatory in our body and in our brain, and really disrupts the delicate balance of neurotransmitters. So learning how to manage our stress with lifestyle behaviors like breath work or meditation or play, other things that we can do to lower our stress is great. Eating a clean diet, listen to how these things are correlated. Eating a clean diet that's low in simple carbohydrates balances our blood sugar and our insulin, but also improves our cortisol levels. So think about stress and blood sugar almost like, little buddies. They play off of each other. When we're stressed, our blood sugar raises, which requires more insulin. When our blood sugar is out of balance, we become more inflamed, which drives more cortisol, and we get into these vicious loops. So when cortisol is elevated, it also affects our immune system. And I mentioned very briefly at the beginning that in our brain, we have glial cells that are part of the immune system of the brain. And so when we're under high stress, these glial cells can become primed or activated, and they start driving inflammation in our brain. And that is a key central foundational principle when it comes to healing our brain, is we have to lower inflammation and lower this activation of these cells. So our brain is constantly burning fuel, and its primary fuel source is usually glucose. Okay, so our body needs to derive glucose to burn and create, functional brains. Our brains can also burn ketones, which is a different discussion we'll have on another day. But when we're riding blood sugar cycles up and down, and we're going high to low, and our diet's not very good, our brain is kind of constantly is getting some energy, and then that energy is dropping, and so we tend to be really, highly productive, and then we crash, and then we reach for more sugary sweets and ride that wave again. So all of that happening every day creates what we call insulin resistance, where our cells become deaf to the effect of insulin. And that tends to move towards prediabetes and then diabetes. This is so important for the brain that current researchers that are looking into the mechanisms behind Alzheimer's disease and other kind of neurodegenerative diseases are calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. It's basically insulin resistance in the brain that's driving this neurodegeneration. So the right diet, the right stress management will help our cells become more or remain sensitive to insulin and regain insulin sensitivity if we've lost it. So one of the things that is also important when it comes to insulin is meal timing. It's not just what we eat, it's when we eat. And I recommend most people eating 3 solid meals a day. Some people do well with something called time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, where we go longer between meals, sometimes 16 hours between meals, and then we eat in an 8-hour block. But the important thing is not to graze and snack all day long. So break those meals up into specific times. Okay, driver number 4. I told you these are all interrelated. So now we're back talking about circadian rhythms. This has to do with our sleep and wake cycles. Our modern world has allowed us to get dysregulated between the natural light and dark cycles of our planet. And so we have learned how to shift and stay up far later than we normally could with electric lights, and wake up far earlier than we normally would with alarm clocks. And this disruption of our circadian clock causes brain changes. So sleep chemistry is driven by melatonin and also serotonin, and it's inversely related to cortisol, as I mentioned before. When we're stressed and our cortisol goes up, particularly at night, it makes it almost impossible for us to sleep or to sleep well. It's hard to relax and quiet our brain when it's constantly getting signals from blue lights off our computer screens or televisions. And, we're staying up far later, working on projects and what have you. So this disrupts our normal sleep cycle, and then it makes it more difficult for us to get the rest we need. And remember, what's happening while we're asleep? Our brain and the rest of our body is repairing. It's pruning the hedges, so to speak. It's cleaning things up that have built up, the debris that's built up from normal metabolic action during the day. So if we're not sleeping well, it's impossible for our brains to function well. This becomes another one of those vicious loops. In fact, an early indicator of neurodegeneration is disrupted sleep. So that becomes a really important area of our lifestyle that needs to be focused on in order to maintain overall brain health. I mean, I like to think of that as like a canary in the coal mine. Things like brain fog, brain fatigue, and insomnia. If that's happening, you know that your brain is headed down the wrong track. Okay, we're headed towards neurodegeneration, and we got to turn that around. All right, so let's talk about driver number 5, inflammation. I mentioned the work of these glial cells, we call microglial cells in the brain. They're part of the immune system in the brain. They should be patrolling and not finding much work to do because the brain is supposed to be really, really sterile. We have what's called the blood-brain barrier, which is supposed to keep toxins and harmful things from the rest of our body from getting into this really pristine area of the brain. So this blood-brain barrier is supposed to keep things out. But when things are going awry in our gut and in our, if we're toxic, our liver's not working well, and we've got other drivers of inflammation, those messages come up and they affect the blood-brain barrier. And they can actually create kind of permeable, they can create a leaky brain. And that triggers these microglia. Now, the police, so to speak, in the brain are on high alert, and they start to shift and they start to become pro-inflammatory. They drive even more inflammation. So if we have inflammation anywhere in the body, it can lead to breakdowns in the blood-brain barrier, which leads to brain inflammation. When the brain's inflamed, it changes the chemistry. And now no longer do we have this perfect balance of serotonin and dopamine and GABA and glutamate and all these neurotransmitters. They get skewed, they get into inflammatory mode, and that drives more and more dysfunction. Left unattended, this progresses and becomes worse over time, and we get even autoimmune issues in the brain. We get depression and mood disorders, and we get neurodegeneration, things like dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. These are all risk factors that go up once the brain is inflamed. Okay, so that leads me to driver number 6, and that is gut dysfunction. The same factors that can cause the barrier in the brain to become leaky can also cause the gut barriers to become leaky. And when the gut barrier is leaky, proteins from the foods we eat, toxins from bacteria that are in our gut, and other, byproducts, waste products of our body can now become systemic. And they even travel along the nerves that link our gut up to our brain. There's a special nerve called the vagus nerve, and these toxins kind of hitch a ride along this nerve. And so what's going on in our gut, this inflammatory issue happening here, quickly drives the brain deeper into inflammation. I did a quick search a while back on PubMed, which is where we can look up all the scientific studies done on something. And it's a database from the National Institutes of Health. And I searched microbiome and brain, and it spit out 2,400 studies looking into all the different ways that the bugs and the microbes in our gut affect our brain. And listen to this interesting abstract from a study in 2017. Gut microbes are capable of producing most neurotransmitters found in the human brain. Evidence is accumulating to support the view that gut microbes influence central neurochemistry and behavior. Translational studies indicate that certain bacteria may have an impact on stress responses and cognitive functioning. Manipulating the gut microbiota with psychobiotics, new term, prebiotics, and even antibiotics offers a novel approach to altering brain function and treating gut-brain axis disorders such as depression and autism. Whoa! All right, what does that say? Even the microbes in our gut can create the neurotransmitters that we need. So if the gut is healthy, it helps us to produce the neurotransmitters that we need. If the gut is unhealthy, we lose those neurotransmitters or we create the wrong kinds at the wrong times. And this can drive behavior like depression and even more kind of robust things like autism, like changes in the brain. Now, one of the downstream effects of gut problems is also just general toxicity. Our body is constantly being bombarded with toxins from our environment, and our digestive system is supposed to be the vehicle by which, the liver kind of cleanses that, moves it into the gallbladder, squirts it into the digestive system, and then it leaves. But if the gut's not happy and healthy, we reabsorb those toxins. And if the liver and the gallbladder aren't healthy, then our body becomes backed up. And not just like constipation, but I mean toxin backup. According to environmental experts, the average household in the US has over 62 different man-made chemicals. Ingredients in common household cleaners have been linked to asthma, cancer, reproductive issues, hormone disruption, and even neurotoxicity. Even things like heavy metals, lead, mercury, aluminum, and others are known to be neurotoxic. And most of them are cumulative, meaning it's not so much one big exposure, but small exposures over time can accumulate in the tissues. And it's very difficult for our body to remove these heavy metals. And so over time, we become more and more neurotoxic. I hope you can see that there's a lot of potential triggers, potential drivers of why the brain and mental health issues are there. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. There are things we can do about every one of these. You don't have to fix them all overnight, but we do need to understand what's happening and then put some focused attention on these core issues so that you can improve. Let's talk about a few takeaways from today. Step 1, get your blood sugar and insulin in order with diet and lifestyle. Follow a nutrient-dense, whole food, paleo-based diet, free from foods that you're allergic or sensitive to. And if you want to get more information about our Healing Diet Reset program, reach out to our office. That's a great way to just clean up the diet and focus in on the foods that are anti-inflammatory that will help stabilize your blood sugar and lower that inflammation. Okay, step number 2, lower your stress levels and balance your cortisol. Relaxation, play, meditation, yoga, prayer, walks in nature. I don't care what you do, but these things need to be a regular part of your daily routine so that you can manage your stress better. Episode 16, episode 10, episode 5 of the podcast talked all about self-care, play, and breath work, which are all excellent ways to lower your stress. Now, step number 3, heal your gut. Learn how to balance your gut through diet, supplementation, probiotics, enzymes. Episode number 7 was all about healing your gut, so I recommend you go back and look at that as well. Some of you are going to want specific guidance on what you need to do to get your brain back in order and how to speed this process up from, years down to several months. So if that's you, please consider reaching out and working with us one-on-one. We'd love to help you create a sustainable lifestyle that will address these 7 major drivers of brain dysfunction and help you get to the bottom of these issues. We've helped so many people overcome their anxiety and their depression, their brain fog, their inflammation, their hormone imbalances, and their gut problems. And we would love to help you. Okay, that's enough for today. Remember to subscribe and like, follow, rate, and comment on this episode. And if you know somebody who needs to understand this information and needs to know that they are in the driver's seat and they can make a difference in the health of their brain, please share this directly with them. There's nothing more powerful than a personal recommendation. Okay, thanks for letting me share this episode with you. Let's go out there and do some good today.